Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm so pleased to see so many students here today. So please be seated. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to the 2025 CAPRI Annual Forum, Building Resilience on Shaky Ground in Asia Pacific. Indeed, you're in Taipei. I know at least 50 of you are here for the first day in Taiwan. The ground could become shaky. I'm delighted to see so many of you here with us in Taipei and thank the global online audience for tuning in to what will be a thought-provoking forum. We're also pleased to announce that we have over 100 students from 4 continents attending the forum in person. Over the next 4 hours, we will hear from experts in a variety of disciplines, discussing some of the most pressing challenges we face in what has already been a very eventful year. Topics will range from the nurturing of research at a time of reduced cross-border collaboration, how the private sector can lead on solving some of the society's biggest sustainability challenges, and what needs to be done to shore up economic resilience in the region. Our speakers assemble here from across Asia, Europe, North America, and the Pacific are some of the finest minds from their fields, and I look forward to hearing their insights. Their thoughts on these topics could not be timelier. In the past 5 months, we have witnessed the dismantling of the international economic and geopolitical order as the Trump administration has set out its America First principles. This instability has created significant turbulence to markets, ruptured diplomatic relations, and done away with America's reputation as the defender of democracies across the globe. For generations, many of Asia-Pacific's economies have focused on building their export capabilities, secure in the knowledge that their security needs were covered by an American government who encouraged flourishing middle-sized economies as a bulwark against the rising influence of China. It appears, for the time being at least, that this era is over, and the region will need to quickly find its grounding in a new global economy. However, in the long term, there are many opportunities in the Asia-Pacific region to assert itself on the global stage, filling some of the vacuum left by international retreat of the United States. As we will hear in today's discussions, in many instances, the region is already taking the steps to improve its resilience and offers examples to be adopted elsewhere in the world. Taipei City is establishing itself as a bastion of innovation and resilience, drawing in talent from across the world who wish to work in its thriving technology sector, for example. Partnerships are springing up across the Pacific, strengthening health systems in some of the most climate-vulnerable locations on the planet. And I'm proud to add that CAPRI is another example of the Asia-Pacific stepping up to address cross-border challenges in this time of uncertainty. Our multidisciplinary research, combining in-house researchers and a global network of experts, many of whom are here with us today, drives impactful policy to address the most critical challenges of today and tomorrow. At a time when many NGOs are facing cutbacks or political backlash, CAPRI is steadfast in its work to enhance global resilience and promote innovative policy. It is therefore fitting that our opening keynote speaker, Sir Robin Niblett, will focus on how the region can forge a path through these turbulent times on his very first trip to Taiwan. Sir Robin Niblett is the former director and chief executive of Chatham House, the world-leading policy institute based in London, and a renowned expert and author on relations between Europe, the United States, and Asia. Prior to his 15 years leading Chatham House, Sir Robin was one of the leaders of CSIS in Washington, D.C., where he cultivated his reputation as a foremost expert on transatlantic relations. A chair and member of numerous World Economic Forum councils, Sir Robin has advised several UK governments and testified before the US Congress, and was appointed a Knight Commander of the Order of St. Michael and St. George. in the Queen's Platinum Jubilee 2022 birthday honors for services to international relations and British foreign policy. His recent research has focused on US-China dynamics in the 21st century. And I'm delighted that Sir Robin will open today's forum with his thoughts on how the Asia-Pacific can navigate the new Cold War between US and China. With that, I hand over the stage to Sir Robin.
With a round of applause, please join me to welcome Sir Robin Niblett. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Shirley. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here at the third forum, CAPRI Forum. You're right, it is my first visit to Taiwan, which strikes me as somewhat inexplicable, but better late than never, as they say. And thrilled to be here with distinguished members of your advisory council, your board, and the other guests who are speaking on the panels after me. I think they might have the easier task on a panel than I have trying to do an opening keynote, but I'm very happy to step up to the challenge you've set for me today. So delighted to be here. How can Asia Pacific navigate, the title says, a new Cold War between the US and China? For those of you who know, I did write a book with that title that I published in March of last year, written in the summer, autumn of 2023. A lot of water has passed under the bridge since then, and maybe I'll be able to allude to some of that when I suggest my thoughts about the future. But what is the Asia Pacific? I don't want to spend too long on this, but I think my recommendations or my thoughts are principally targeted at those liberal democracies that we find in this region, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and of course, Taiwan, New Zealand, there's others as well. But there's only a certain group that I think are picking up the responsibilities that come with being liberal democracies for the long term. And I want to do three things with my roughly 15 minutes I think I've got. I'll do my best to stick to time because I know you've got a lot on your agenda today. First of all, just explain why I think there is a new Cold War. For those of you who are students here, you might know it is a contested concept. And some people would rather people like me didn't say there is one, because if we say it, maybe it makes it so. But I think it's better to call a spade than to ignore it. Otherwise, we won't be able to react to its challenges. And I think understanding the dynamics that are driving it are important. So that's the first thing I'll talk about. Secondly, we have just entered, I think, the second chapter of the new Cold War with Donald Trump's return to the White House. And his arrival obviously requires adaptation and new responses. And then third, let me just say a few words then about what, given points 1 and 2, what are the options for, in particular, the liberal democracies in Asia Pacific. So starting at the beginning, why is there a new Cold War? I mean, it is a truly geopolitical contest between the United States and China. As Pete Hegseth, the new US Defense Secretary, put it, China is our first peer competitor. Again, for the students here, you will have read all about the Thucydides trap that Professor Graham Allison of Harvard University coined originally back in 2017. A rising power will generally find its way resisted by the established power, and the risk generally, historically, was war. Obviously, today, we live in a nuclear-armed world, and the prospects of war between the great powers become diminished. Obviously, not zero, but much less, and hence Cold Wars in general. And if you look at the nature of the US-China relationship, the framing in which this competition and this Cold War is taking place covers all of the dimensions of international power and interest. It's an economic Cold War. You've got the two biggest economic countries by nominal GDP in the world's biggest consumer market, the world's biggest export and exporter. But the important thing here is that Americans believe, in general, that China has grown to this position on the back of America, that has not done it simply through its own hard work. And America is now determined to try to stop being a helper, and say to China, good luck, but you're not going to do it with us. China, of course, believes, probably correctly, that America wants to prevent China's rise from happening as easily as it was and to contain it economically. It's also a military contest. China, obviously, if it wants to be economically secure as a world's largest exporter, wants to be able to break out of the first island chain that runs from South Korea through Japan, through Taiwan, obviously, to the northern Philippines, in which that means that gaining control of Taiwan is a geopolitical challenge for China, not simply a broader political one. And we've seen China's investment in its navy, the efforts it's making to control the South China Sea, its new investment in nuclear capability and nuclear warheads, heading potentially to match the United States and Russia. And this kind of realization that economic and military strength are absolutely intertwined. And there's probably no better description of that than the way in which China has now become by far the world's largest producer or shipbuilder, producer of shipping tonnage, close to 90% of world tonnage last year. And it is a technological contest between these two powers as well, not only because technology is critical to economic growth, but it's central to what President Xi Jinping talks about as civil-military fusion. The most basic technologies, as well as the most advanced, such as AI, can strengthen a country's military capability. But I want to say that this is also an ideological Cold War. And the reason it's a Cold War, there's an ideological dimension to it. And I don't mean here the contest between communism and capitalism, but it is between top-down, centralized systems of government in which those in power believe that they represent the sovereignty of their country and that there must be no challenge to that central position that they hold, and countries that believe in the kind of creative destruction that comes from bottom-up, more chaotic systems of democratic government. The problem we have is that each side, the United States and China, fears that the other system is a threat to it. If you're in the Chinese leadership, you fear that the US wants to undermine its leadership by spreading democracy around the world, new color revolutions, as they describe it, supporting human rights groups in China, challenging the CCP's legitimacy, always talking about the Chinese people as separate from the Communist Party of China, and supporting human rights activists in general. Complaints about Hong Kong, Xinjiang, etc. In that context, I think they believe that Taiwan, in a way, is being used as a kind of missile of democracy, as I describe it in my book, against the CCP. And so Taiwan is not just part of the geopolitical contest between the US and China, it is also part of the ideological contest between the two countries. Of course, if you're in America, and as Shirley noted, I spent half my career working in Washington. It's not quite America, but it is Washington. American politicians believe that top-down systems of government are inherently unstable eventually. And they end up externalizing their internal sources of insecurity, whether it be through wanting to create buffer zones or trying to undermine the strength of their opponents. And if you look at the whole issue of technology, as I mentioned before, being important in the geopolitical level of the context, technology, of course, is also important in the ideological dimension, not just the way Russia, in particular, has been using misinformation and disinformation to undermine European democracy, but also the extent to which China and its use of ByteDance's TikTok technology is seen as undermining potentially America's democratic and political consistency and integrity. In fact, I think one of the most interesting examples of how this overlay between ideology, technology, and geopolitics come together was Matt Pottinger, the former China advisor in the National Security Council of Trump 1.0, when writing in Foreign Affairs of the one way that they thought they could actually try to move beyond managed strategic competition with China to actually undermining the Communist Party's control over China, he talked about his one idea, as far as I could tell, was breaking the CCP's great firewall around the Chinese internet, and the way that that's been used to kind of try and keep the Chinese people and the Communist Party separate. The US-China contest, of course, really became a Cold War, if I can mention this quickly at the end of my first point, because of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I don't need to go into the details here, but it forced China to pick sides. It picked Russia, even though it hasn't formally broken sanctions, but de facto it seems to be, and certainly if you look at the sanctions imposed by the US and European governments on Chinese companies for supporting dual-use technology, the narrative certainly has been supported by Beijing of this being a defensive war. But what it did was force the Europeans back to relying on America for their security. And it's raised the sense of insecurity in Asia-Pacific allies of America, Japan, South Korea, Australia. They're not just facing China anymore. They're facing China and Russia collectively together. And in fact, China and Russia and North Korea and Iran. And you put that combination of countries together, and it really, if you're sitting in Washington, looks like a rogues gallery, or as has been described by the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, as a new axis of evil. And certainly what we saw towards the tail end of the Biden administration was a knitting together of America's Pacific and Atlantic allies, with prime ministers of Japan, South Korea, Australia attending NATO summits, and the Europeans, as one example, increasingly active in freedom of navigation operations in the Asia-Pacific seas. In a way, the world has been sort of adapting to this new Cold War already in the last couple of years. China, even earlier, I would say, which started its de-risking program back in 2015 with Made in China 2025. The US responded with Trump 1.0, imposing, putting Chinese companies, technology companies on the entity list. Biden then had its small yard and high fence, a limited number of technologies that would be prevented from having access to the US market. Onshoring of production, chips, trying to sort of build up America's economic capability, and the emergence of the G7 as a kind of steering committee for coordinating the positions of both America's Atlantic and Pacific allies towards both China and Russia. But the start of the new Cold War was also notable because it created opportunities for many countries around the world, in particular those countries across the global south that now account for 65% of world population, nearly 30% of world GDP. Those countries have been able to play one side off the other, triangulate between the United States and China, whether it be India, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, take your pick, Brazil. They've all done pretty well out of this. We've seen the emergence of continued trade deepening that's crossed the boundaries between the two sides of the Cold War, with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a sort of China at least initiated idea for closer trade relations across the Asia-Pacific. And we had the whole famous China +1, the idea that companies that got a little bit worried about the Cold War would nonetheless be able to operate out of ASEAN bases in particular, and then export to America or Mexico as well, into America, into the rest of the world, without looking like they were exporting from China. So that kind of was the world as was. To move to the second part, of course, we now have Donald Trump in power. And that brings up a whole range of new risks and dimensions. And in my mind, it opens up a second chapter in the beginning of this new Cold War. Certainly, I think it looks like the Trump administration, and I'm picking my words carefully here, continues to see China as the core threat to the United States. I'm not going to use tariffs as the example of that. I think that's probably more a Trump thing about tariffs, which I think we all know about. It goes back a long, long way before there was any talk of a new Cold War between the United States and China. But if you look at the way that Taiwan has been redefined, or at least the removal of references about US not supporting Taiwan independence, been taken off the State Department kind of list. You look at the sale of F-16s to the Philippines, 20 of those. You look at 70 new Chinese companies put on the entity list by the new Trump administration. Even NVIDIA's H20 chips 200 ships, are now prevented from being exported to help China with its continued AI capability. So in some senses, we have continuity. But in one very important respect, we have a fundamental difference, which is that Donald Trump, of course, does not believe in alliances. And that was the very definition of how Biden was managing the Cold War and the Biden administration in the first chapter. In fact, I would say he has a very different viewpoint. Allies are the ones to be taken advantage of. If you have power, why would you be nice to other people a priori in return for nothing? This goes against the Trumpian mentality, as I would see it. In fact, it's better off to try to abuse allies because they need you, especially if you're the world's largest consumer market and the provider of your allies' security, whereas you need to negotiate with rivals because they don't need maybe as much from you, or you try to create leverage in order to be able to acquire it. So what we have in a way is a whole bunch of risks emerging as a result of this idea that Trump has that in a way you want to negotiate more with your rivals than with your allies. First problem, of course, is he believes, as far as we can tell, in spheres of influence. Now, as a European, we're living that fear today, and it's leading to all sorts of reactions by European governments. But obviously, if you're sitting in Taiwan or Japan or South Korea, it really raises that risk that emerges from not just a rising China militarily, but a rising China with its ally in, certainly its aligned country in Russia. The whole idea that even if Trump isn't that engaged in thinking about China as a military threat, maybe he will be laid back as China continues to accelerate the gray zone operations that have been taking place around Taiwan, in particular, literally raising in temperature over the last 2 years, as I said, in particular, with military exercises taking place all around the island. We have similar increase in naval activity around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, challenge between Japan and China. And South Korea itself is finding similar challenges to contested islands with Beijing. So we've seen Beijing pick up the temperature since Trump has come back, not through any overt mechanisms, but through these kind of gray zone type operations that they described. We have, obviously, more broadly from an Asia-Pacific perspective, a fear that Trump is bringing in a me-first economics that can be deeply, deeply damaging to economies across this part of the world that have relied for so long on access to global markets, but in particular to the US market to be able to drive their growth. And that's without even mentioning the worries about having America pulling out of things like climate change negotiations or global health coordination, which matter so much to this region. So it is a very, very challenging moment. We've got the continuity of a Cold War, which, as I said, I believe is deeply rooted. It looked like we had a sort of structure to be able to deal with it emerging at the end of the Biden administration. We now have Trump coming in. The Cold War continues, but the sort of informal emergence of rules, alliances, borders seems to have been thrown up completely in the air. So to finish up, what do we do? And what do Asia-Pacific countries do at this moment? Let me make 3 broad buckets of recommendations. There isn't time for Q&A today, but I think all the panels that will follow will pick up these points and dig into them or bring up their own or challenge the points I'm going to make right now. But let me lay out 3 buckets. First of all, bilateral treaty arrangements with America remain vital for its Asia-Pacific allies, but obviously they can no longer be relied on in the medium term, or certainly not in the short term. So I mean, pick my words carefully. They cannot be relied upon in the short term, certainly as long as Donald Trump is there. So you have to become more resilient individually. I'm not telling you anything original here. Look at what Europe is doing. Asia-Pacific is starting to do as well, spending more on defense. Taiwan talking about 3% of GDP, Japan going to 2%. It doesn't mean having to buy all the biggest or most expensive kit. Look at what Ukraine is being able to do, driving the Russian Navy out of the Black Sea. Well, not out of the Black Sea, but certainly out of Crimea and down towards Novorossiysk. There are really inventive things that inventive countries can do. hybrid resilience, the resilience against the gray zone warfare. Again, Taiwan, I think, very skilled at this already. Other countries, perhaps around the Asia Pacific, South Korea, Japan, catching up with hybrid warfare, especially disinformation, cyber warfare, etc. Energy resilience is going to be absolutely essential. Again, as we've learnt in Europe, depending on your rivals or even depending on allies that you can't trust, is something you have to be trying to avoid. And again, I think Ukraine is showing interesting examples here. Distributed energy, it's not just about diversification, it's about a more resilient type of energy system as well. And of course, economic resilience, reducing over-dependencies, not just on export markets such as the US, or import points from China. We all need to engage in that activity. Second of my three big buckets, becoming more resilient collectively. Now, I appreciate this is much more challenging in the Asia Pacific than it is in Europe. We are contiguous geographically. NATO, the EU was created under the umbrella as a collective form of economic and security organization, EU, NATO, with American protection. We've built up that muscle memory, those infrastructures, integrated military commands that you don't have here. But I think there are opportunities nonetheless to lean in economically to ASEAN, to other forms of regional economic integration, look for deepening, opening up those markets more amongst yourselves, not reliant on America. By all means, bring in the EU, countries that also rely on deeper trade integration, unlike America. If you can get an EU CPTPP deal, that would be fantastic. And of course, Indonesia, which is going to struggle to become members of these organizations, a member of these organizations can nonetheless use its private sector to use them as avenues for investment. And India, I think, obviously is a huge opportunity there as well. From a security standpoint, again, it's a matter of retaining relationships collectively with your European allies. And I think we were discussing earlier at lunch today, the GCAP program between Japan, UK, and Italy for a new next fighter generation aircraft is a good example. AUKUS's Pillar 2, the Australia, UK, US technology agreement has great opportunities there as well. I know the US administration is saying we don't need Europeans in Indo-Pacific security. They'll probably say we don't need Asia-Pacific people in European security. I'd say ignore that advice. They would say that, wouldn't they? Because if playing allies off each other is partly the Trump game, we shouldn't play it, while still being nice to the Trump administration and not saying that to its face. I said it, but there we go. I'm not in government, so I can say it. And I think for Taiwan in particular, if I can make this one point before concluding, I understand that historically, I'm no expert on Taiwan, there's been this focus on sort of some of the global South relationships that involved recognition of Taiwan. But really, it strikes me that Taiwan's future lies with the other liberal democracies that rely on America for their security, as does Taiwan. And therefore, looking for deeper economic relationships, business relationships with the G7 plus countries, EU, UK, Canada, Japan, Australia, would be absolutely vital for Taiwan's future. And my last point, time's up. So I'm on time, hopefully. My last point is that I think we have to be very thoughtful about how we reset relationship with the United States. It is easy to get wrapped up right now in the crisis mode that Donald Trump almost naturally creates to give himself and his administration leverage. But my judgment call, based on having lived and worked in America 15 years, watched it for another 15 from London and from Chatham House, is that I think the US will return to relying on allies. There's no way that the United States will be able to deal with a combined Russia-China, and I don't believe that relationship is going to be broken by anyone in the near term, especially a Russia-China that has got close relationships with Iran and with North Korea, and potentially with other autocratic regimes around the world. There's no way that it can take on that challenge and be economically successful without having allies at its side. So the challenge for us is how can we make sure that we are better allies for an America that is probably going to wake up to its need for alliances again in 4, maybe at a stretch 8 years' time. We're probably going to need 8 years to become good allies. If we can do it in 4, all the better. But I think that's the challenge that lies ahead, not just for European countries where I've come from to this conference, but for those countries that are America's allies in the Asia-Pacific as well. So I'll stop there, look forward to the rest of the conference, and hopefully have a chance to compare notes with some of you over coffee later on. Thank you for the opportunity, Shirley.
Thank you. Thank you, Sir Robin Niblett, for this brief yet very comprehensive sketch of the geopolitical landscape now we face. And more valuably, we have very concrete advices from Sir Robin Niblett.